And the whole notion.
Okay, here's a problem already.
Uh-oh. Is that better?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. But you always, you don't always want the person looking in the camera anyhow.
No, I understand. But this is
They always, whenever I do media interviews, they say, don't look at the camera, don't look at the camera. They always sit way over to the side, so you have to look. It's one of those professional things. So.
You're not supposed to look at the camera.
I don't know.
Well, you can look at us, but see, we'll be within camera range.
So you haven't started yet.
No, I'm just trying to get a
Trying to
visual
get the
sense. I'm looking at it and trying
What
to
we
figure
should
out.
do before you start, we should just kind of set a general framework for how Jim can start off.
Yeah.
And basically the idea here was, we were joking around with Terry Folan last weekend?
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember I have no weekends anymore. And we're joking around, this is going to be a DVD set that we're going to make available for, people could buy, for the history of Jim Holiman and the idea. And he said, hey, I'd buy one.
Well, Terry's a fool.
So basically the idea is, to give, and we've talked about doing this with VVAW guys too, depending on how this goes, try to get Barry to sit down and do something like this too. So the idea is basically storytelling, and getting your story across in a way that you feel most comfortable, elaborating. It's not a lecture. It's basically, and as questions occur, we don't have set questions. As questions occur to us, we basically just kind of, throw them out. So mainly it's giving you a chance to say, here's who I am, here's where I started. Some of the stuff we've heard before, but every time you talk, we hear something new, and that was the idea of having it recorded, and then just build on that.
Well, I think part of the impetus too was the activist forum.
Yeah.
Where, one, you put together a lot of stuff, and because of the time constraints,
You felt limited.
you couldn't get to everything.
Yeah.
And there were times where I wanted to ask questions during that, but no, it wouldn't be appropriate for a mass forum. But here it'd be more appropriate to say, hey, wait, what about that?
Yeah.
So to be kind of like that, but less formal.
Okay.
And then, each session, will give us some notion of what we want to cover the next session. Okay?
Next session, we bring Guinness.
Well,
we could. Sure.
We could. That's why we might want to do it at the treehouse or something, Joe.
That's right.
Or Jim.
Or maybe we could have a session at my place.
Whatever.
That's a possibility.
Depending on, we could do it, and then maybe a session at Jeff.
What I kind of want to do is we do this for like, hour or so and see how it goes. And then at the end of it, we kind of make our plans. Like, okay, based on how this section went. Because when you and I talked, part of it was looking at chronologically. So start,
Sure.
we move chronologically. Doesn't mean that we're going to have to adhere to the strict chronological thing, but to kind of move through time.
Right.
And a lot of people, Martine, Claudia, and Jen, for sure all wanted to be here. But there's this Jobs with Justice thing, and there's other things. But that's, but we have, I figure we have quite a few sessions. We don't have to limit ourselves to the number of sessions. It's not like we have to get this done by timeline A or timeline B. It's just to do it, to capture it. And also I want to look at the first one and see, did the sound come out okay? Did the video come out okay? Because I haven't really done much. Most of what I do is shoot rallies.
Yes.
And
That's how we got started.
And
We started
events.
shooting rallies.
So I guess why are we ready to go then?
Sure.
Okay. Just give us and don't feel limited by time, but give us another presentation of your background, your family's background, and see how we move toward this, the early 50s period and stuff.
And as you've taught us in the political autobiographies,
Yeah.
start at the beginning or the pre-beginning.
Yeah.
Pre-beginnings.
Well, the family.
Well, I don't know if that came out as strong as it should be, probably.
You mean at the activist forum?
Yeah. Because a lot of the enigma of my life begins in that family setting. Partly because the family was so weird. By that I mean, Mom was 43 when I was born, Dad was too. My brother was old enough to be my father. In fact, he has a son older than me. So there was this generation gap, and that was created a lot of problems.
So so were they all older than you, all your brothers and sisters?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, about 10 years separating, not quite 10 years separating all of us, but just about 10 years. So,
And you're the baby?
and I was the baby, which had its good points and its bad points. And Mom and Dad had gone through some kind of transition themselves between kind of they came out of rural settings, and by the time they got married, the community was beginning to urbanize, and that no doubt had a problem or created problems for them. Dad only got to the 3rd grade before he had to start working. And he had to support a family of 11 as a 3rd grader.
This was all in Arkansas?
Yeah. His older brother, or his dad died, and his older brother, who should have been the one who had become the breadwinner, decided that was not for him, so he took off. So that left the next male, which was Dad. So as a person who had basically learned how to read and to write and do some mathematics, he started working to support that family.
What kind of work did you do?
Started off as a person who worked in grocery stores, sweeping up the floors.
And what time would this have been? What decade?
This would have been just about the turn of the century, about 1900, I guess. Then he started carrying ice, working out of the ice house, and carrying ice up many floors to apartments, because that's all the refrigeration they had at the turn of the century was ice. Then he got into the furniture moving business, carrying furniture from a wagon, horse-drawn wagon, to apartments or whatever, wherever the furniture had to go.
And this was in Little Rock, or this
No,
was
Hot Springs.
Hot Springs?
So, in that kind of a setting, he grew up in a mining town, and from a mining town into this urban setting where you had to have an education in order to survive, must have been quite a struggle. And I was never able to bridge that gap of our ages and transition with him. So there was not a whole lot of constructive conversation going on there. There were attempts that he made and attempts that I made, but we just meshed. We didn't mesh. We didn't mesh. Mom got to finish high school. So she was very interested in educational kinds of things. My first memory, or one of my first memories with her, is her beginning to read to me out of books, which was became a weekly thing. So books were not a mystery to me, because she introduced me to books as a very young kid.
What kind of books are we talking about at this point?
The one that I remember very clearly was the World Encyclopedia, which I'm sure she had, going through grocery stores and other places, earned enough coupons to secure this encyclopedia. would sit down in the living room, and she would pull out a volume of this encyclopedia, and she would read some things, but mostly we would look at pictures, and she would explain the pictures.
Was this with the other kids too, or just with you?
No, I don't know, because they weren't around by
Oh,
that. You know,
okay.
They
Marietta
were all
was
much older.
Yeah, Marietta was maybe 13 when I was born. So.
So they were in school.
Yeah, and Alan was, he was long gone by that time. Lois was too. So Marietta and I were the only two that grew up together, so to speak. And Alan had collected a lot of World War I novels when he was growing up, so later I began to read those things. On my own. Mom wouldn't read those to me for some reason, but I found them and read them.
Can I jump in and?
Sure.
So how did your family end up in Arkansas?
How'd they end up there?
I mean, were there generations and generations? I mean, I know Joe and I's story involves immigration
Mm-hmm.
at some point in the not too recent past.
Well, the first Holiman moved into Arkansas from Mississippi right after the Civil War. I forget the date. Anyway, he was his name was Mose, as was my dad's, and he must have, he had been a doctor in Mississippi. He had learned medicine by reading books.
What ethnicity?
Hmm?
What ethnicity?
A Holiman.
Well, but
He wants to go further back, Jim.
He wants to go further back.
What's your,
The
family-
Hollimans,
the
we
family
can trace
ethnics.
back to North and South Carolina. And then there's a big jump from there, as far as I can tell, back to England. And on our recent trip to UK, wasn't able to find out a whole lot, other than the clues that Lois, my older sister, had dug up. Her story was that the name goes back to some guy who was apparently a part of a Roman legion, who was kind of the chaplain. So the name is Holy Man. And I reminded Lois that, well, there were other holy men in UK at that time, and they were mostly Druids, which she didn't appreciate very much.
So the family came over from England, at least the Holiman part, around when, you think? Pre-Civil War?
Yeah. But we're not sure about the date, but it was before the Civil War.
so sometime in the 1900s, not earlier than that.
1800s.
Or 1800s, I'm sorry.
It could have been earlier,
Yeah.
but
Okay.
the only information I have is that grows out of a book in the Garland County Library, which traces by census people back, and the Hollimans go back to North Carolina. And then they migrate through the southern states. And this guy named Mose is listed in the census in Mississippi.
Is that short for Moses, or is that
Don't know.
just M-O-Z-E or
M-O-S-E.
M-O-S-E? Mose.
Like
And
Mose
then-
Allison.
Yeah.
And then he migrates into Arkansas, and apparently he had some money. He bought up a bunch of land on the southwest sector of around Hot Springs. Dad's recollection was that it was several thousand acres.
And this was your dad's grandfather, or dad's
His grandfather.
grandfather?
So that area, he built a house in several places, but ended up on what was called Holiman Hill. So Holiman Hill was the name that was given to that territory for at least a couple of generations. And the Garland County census shows that Dad's father and his grandfather had become something of a political figure, especially Dad's grandfather, because he was elected to some office. I don't recall what that office was. But he maintained his medical practice. It apparently passed on to from his father. Somehow they got into the orchard business and made some money running an orchard.
And so the mom's family is ethnically.
Mom's family is easier to trace so far.
Is that Buchanan's or is that?
Buchanan's, yeah. William Henry Harrison Buchanan was the first Buchanan into the U.S. as far as we can tell. And the census of New York and Delaware picked him up in 1749.
Then from Scotland?
Yes, he'd come from Scotland. And that was one of the things we'd hoped to find out this last trip. Buchanan's had, during the Revolution, had split. Some favored the monarchy, some, that is, they favored the new king. Some favored the old king, which was the Stuart crown. And so they fought on both sides. But anyway, the end result was that all of the clans lost their territories, lost their name, lost their estates. We're not allowed to speak Gaelic. We're not allowed to wear the traditional dress.
So lost over here, you mean, in the
No,
United
lost
States?
there.
No.
Oh, lost there.
In Scotland.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Not the American Revolution.
Mhm.
That's right. Got it.
No.
Sorry.
So a lot of the Buchanans and a lot of other clans, I guess, split up and went various ways. And one of the ways they could go were to the colonial holdings. So this guy shows up in the Delaware census in 1749. He had been an officer in the Revolutionary Army. So when Washington pulled together his forces, this guy was chosen to be the commander of the army segment that was given Long Island to defend against the British. They lost, but apparently he pulled off some heroic actions. So after the war was over, he was given all of Long Island and 5,000 acres in Pennsylvania. And for some reason, he decided to go to Pennsylvania. So, and there the family branches out. Some go to the south, some stay in Pennsylvania and go across the country to the northern states. The southern section went into Virginia, and the guy there was named, his first name was John. He married, the family story is that he married a princess in the Cherokee Nation. And so then that portion of the family moves to the southern states. Some of it participates in the expulsion of the Cherokee to Oklahoma. Some settle out in various places. And Mom's recollection seems to be that the Buchanans were a part of that group of Cherokee who made it into Arkansas.
So by the Civil War, both parts of the family were in Arkansas?
Yeah. And the family lived down at where what's called Gulfer Creek runs into the Washita River, or was the Washita River. And they had a small farm there. And during the Civil War, Grant was laying siege to Vicksburg at the time, and that was kind of a stalemate for almost a year. Anyway, he and Sherman were already concocting the policy of scorched earth as the way to finish off the war. And so Grant ordered Sherman to take Arkansas and to practice the policy. So he did. And the stories that Mom told about that, of course she learned those from her mom, was that when, after Little Rock fell, the capital moved to Hot Springs. So that was the next target. And the battles were fought on the south side of the Washita River. Unfortunately, their farm was on the south side of the Washita River.
This is the Buchanans.
Yeah. So they had some pretty horrendous stories about what happened to the farm. And Mom told these stories as if she were an eyewitness to them. And the story she told was that the Yankees came in, forced all the old guys and the young male children into the barn, set it on fire, and as they tried to escape, shoot them. So she had great hatred. Now, of course, she didn't see this herself, but she told the stories as if she did, and the anger was very much there, which went a long way for explaining her support of Dad and the Ku Klux Klan and the Reconstruction period, which had come to an end already, about the time they were born. So the Jim Crow laws were beginning to come into play as they reached puberty, and so they were imbibing of this, the winning of the peace following Reconstruction.
So the Hollimans were small landowners at this point with some property, so somewhat of a little higher class, and the Buchanans, at least that settled in Arkansas, were poorer than that.
Yeah, that's my impression.
How is it that your mom got to get a high school education?
Well, high school education was not what we would know as high school
Yeah,
education. Basically, the family made sure that she stayed in school rather than get married early, which was the norm. All of her sisters got through high school.
So they had a pretty progressive notion of
Yes.
schooling and education.
Yes. So the males, on the other hand, I think did not necessarily succeed in getting that achievement or making it through high school. But
So how big was your mom's immediate family?
13 kids.
13. Wow, so her and your dad's families were both
Yeah, very large.
big.
But that was pretty much,
The norm.
that's what people did then, right?
Yeah, well, if you were going to survive, you had to have lots of kids.
Yeah.
That was a big thing. Families were not nuclear in the sense that we know nuclear. They were more extended, and bloodlines were very important.
And you'd have multi-generations living together and stuff.
Right. Families were, if there were lots of girls, the families into which they married, but that was a very crucial decision. For example, the Hollimans and the Higdons did not get along.
Who were the Higdons?
They were another family.
Oh, okay.
They owned, the best I can make of it was that they owned the rights to the ferries that crossed the river. So anyone who was interested in crossing the river had to deal with the Higdons. And if you didn't get along with the Higdons, you weren't able to cross the river, or you paid a higher price for crossing the river. So there was no question of Lois or Marietta marrying into the Higdon family, for example. Or there wouldn't, and certainly in the Higdon family there would have been, that would have been a no-no too. So these two families did not get along. And you learned that very early.
So on the Buchanan girls going to high school, so was that public education at that point, or did that mean that there had to be
No,
some?
there was no public education at that stage of the game.
So there had to be a financial commitment as well.
Mhm.
So what was that family doing that was able to afford to do that?
Well, the school that Mom went to was the Shady Grove School. And it was a one-room schoolhouse, one teacher, all grades were in that one school. House still stands. It's now kind of a bar that services the people who play golf on the Oakland golf course. It's a big place. It's the largest golf course in the South. In fact, it's 2 golf courses. And some of the big golf games are played there. But the old schoolhouse was turned into this bar about the 9th hole of course B.
But was it religious education, or was it?
No, I don't believe so. Because I say that because neither Mom nor Dad were very religious. Dad also went to that school some of the time. The schoolhouse was located about a mile from where Dad's from Holiman Hill. Mom was maybe 2 miles from it. So, and it was one of those stories they told, you know, in the middle of winter there were 12 feet of snow and they trudged. Of course, there was never 12 feet of snow in Arkansas. That's the way they remembered it.
And when you're little, it might feel like that.
Yeah, right. Trudging off to the Shady Grove Schoolhouse.
So it sounds like because of your dad's family situation where he was the male to have to take responsibility, then you know that's where his schooling ends.
Mm-hmm.
And your mom's situation was much better in that sense. There was more of a family support network, and
Right.
and there was a commitment to girls' education. So,
Mhm.
okay, so there's these like.
So what brought the
2
Hollimans
tracks.
and Buchanans together?
Yeah,
At least the 2
Those
particular
2.
ones.
Yeah, those 2. Yeah, well, that was a story they told often. Their first meeting was Mom and her family had taken a lot of apples and peaches to town to market one weekend. And Dad and his family were also going into town for whatever. And she spotted him. They were on a wagon. She was riding in a wagon carrying the stuff, and Dad and his family apparently were walking. And as they passed them, she spotted Dad, and so she decided to hit him with a peach, so she threw a peach at him.
How old were they at this point?
I have no idea.
Teenagers?
I guess so.
Okay.
Anyway, that was the first time they laid eyes on one another.
And peaches.
And peaches. Now, Mom was an exceedingly beautiful woman, and Dad was a very handsome man. So I think that story stuck in their mind because they stuck in one another's minds. I don't know if I think you've seen their wedding picture. It was out in the treehouse anyway.
Maybe.
But they made a striking couple, and I suspect that was partly the reason why she threw a peach at him. That she was attracted and she wanted to get his attention.
So what year did they get married?
What year did they get married? Mom was 21, so she was born in 19 or 18.
So that's pretty old to get married at that point, isn't it?
Huh?
Wasn't that pretty old to get married at that?
Oh yeah, yeah. It was old even when I was growing up for a woman to date that long. So what would that year
She was born
1893.
1893, so
20 years later.
14,
Would be
1914,
1914, something.
right?
And then how old was Dad?
He was
mean, was
about 6 months younger than she.
Oh, so about the same age.
Same age. They were married before the U.S. entered World War One.
So it might have been right before that.
Yeah.
Well, we didn't get into it right away. We didn't get into it till 1917.
Well, the propaganda started in 1916.
Mm.
So, but 1917 was when the first troops landed in Europe.
And did Dad participate in that at all, or?
When the draft started, he wanted to join up, so he went down to enlist, but he was too short.
Mm.
So they wouldn't take him.
Hmm.
So he didn't get served.
Was your mom tall?
She-
Taller?
Mom was 5'7".
Okay.
Dad was about the same, a little shorter maybe.
Okay.
5'7" wasn't tall enough to serve?
Apparently not. So anyway, he did not serve, which served Mom no end, because she had Alan at that particular time. I think Alan was less than a year old, and I'm sure she was not looking forward to Dad going. She didn't apparently oppose his enlisting. The propaganda stuff was really high. They were both big supporters of Wilson, and so I suppose they would have done anything that Wilson would have said.
And how did they survive at this point? What was Dad doing?
What was Dad doing? Well, he was beginning. He and one of Mom's sisters had married a guy named Bill Evans, who was a mechanic. And he started out as a bicycle mechanic. But automobiles were coming along, and so he had started tearing apart automobiles and learning how to put them back together. So he became an automobile mechanic. And he had probably convinced Dad that, look, we can make a fortune by selling and repairing automobiles. So they were beginning to play around with automobiles, used cars mostly at that point. Later they got into selling and setting up dealerships for General Motors. Then later, when I knew Dad, it was Chrysler Products. So the automobile business was what Dad and Uncle Bill did. Uncle Bill became the foreman of Dad's shop, and Dad ran the front office, which was selling the cars. So that's how they made their way. Mom was the bookkeeper for the business, so everybody was involved in that. Alan became something of an automobile mechanic too, so he learned that trade from Uncle Bill, I'm sure.
So by the time you were born, was that still the business, or had it?
Oh, yeah. The farm had become secondary. It kept us alive during the war, and I guess earlier during the Depression. But after, once the economy began to shift into a war footing, Dad basically gave up the farm and gave all of his time to the automobile business.
And so what year were you born, Jim?
35. So the farm fell to Mom, Loretta, and me. My job was dealing with the cows, the horses, the chickens, the rabbits, the pigs. Mom and Loretta took care of the garden.
How big was the farm at this
5
point?
acres.
And you lived on the farm?
Yeah. Now, farm in Arkansas is basically raising rocks, at least in the Washita Mountains, which we were in the foothills of. So
Sounds tasty.
So basically, the garden, which was fairly good size, was kind of an artificial creation. Somewhere along the line, during the Depression, Dad had filled in a big chunk of a gully back of the house, and leveled it off some way, and they planted the garden on this leveled place. Otherwise, they would have been growing among rocks.
So it was basically animals? I mean, that's what the selling of
Livestock.
animals, livestock?
Yeah,
That's
we
what-
had, the garden, as I said, only took up probably an acre. And the rest then was given over to pasture and a barn. We had 5 or 6 Jersey cows, which really produced great milk. My uncle George, who lived down the road a ways, he was raising Hereford steers. So together we had kind of a lock on beef and milk. And so we would sell the milk and the beef to local grocery stores or to individuals. I was raising chickens like crazy, and so we would sell chickens and eggs. Rabbits also. I hated to sell rabbits.
And how old were you when you were doing this?
So it is I can remember, which probably was 5 or 6 or 7 or 8.
So before you were going into any kind of school?
Yeah. Pigs were not my favorite things either, because pigs, for that young a kid, pigs are unmanageable. So Marietta had to help raise the pigs.
What did you hate about selling the rabbits? Or taking
They
the
were
rabbits?
cute.
Okay. It's hard to part
kill-
with them.
It's hard to kill a rabbit. Chickens were not difficult to kill, although it was a messy business. You killed them by either chopping off their heads or yanking their heads off. Yanking their heads off was the quicker way, but chopping their heads off was the cleaner way. So you had to choose which was the most efficient.
Yeah, my
thing.
grandmother apparently was doing that in the west side of Chicago
Yeah.
around this, probably the same time.
Yeah. So, but what that did during the war years, since everybody was on rationing, was we didn't have to rely so much upon rationing and the black market to take care of sustenance of the family.
So at this time, in the Arkansas area where your family's at, what's the basic economy?
Gambling.
Gambling at this point? So that's
I got started in the 20s. Well, it got
So
started.
so it's an agricultural area or semi-agricultural or farming area, but if that wasn't enough to,
Well, that was the family side of the story. We were
okay.
Basically, we were agrarian oriented prior to at least the turn of the century. But gambling had moved into Hot Springs during the Reconstruction era. A lot of the railroads that were running out of Chicago for wealthy folk who wanted to go on vacation ran to Hot Springs. In fact, one of the main railroads was built from Chicago straight to Hot Springs. It went through Little Rock, probably went on down to New Orleans too. But it cut off a branch and went into Hot Springs. It was called Diamond Gem Railroad.
so tourism was
Tourism
a crucial
was-
part of the economy
and
going
wealthy
back.
people from the north were coming to Hot Springs for 2 reasons. The first reason was to bathe in the magic waters of the springs, because they have all kinds of health problems that the waters didn't cure any of the health problems, but people thought they did. At least they felt better after they took the bath. So they were coming down for that. And the spa industry began to develop, building these really neat bathhouses. First they were made out of wood, then later they were made out of really beautiful rock, and turned into these mammoth bathhouses. Washita River was, the lakes had not been built on the river at that time. So the Washita River was a main travel route from New Orleans up through the Mississippi to Arkansas Post, and then up the Washita River all the way up into Oklahoma. So a lot of traffic, commercial traffic, was on that river. And it didn't take folk very long to figure out that not only was it good for transporting goods, but it was also good for recreation. And since the spa industry was there at Hot Springs, it was a place that people could go if they were from the south, up to Hot Springs to engage in the bathing, but also to gamble. So riverboat gambling became important. And once they got to Hot Springs, people began to say, well, you know, we could set up gambling in Hot Springs itself, just not riverboat gambling. So that began to happen. Well, somewhere in the teens and the 20s, Al Capone figured this out as a great place, so he began to set his business up in Hot Springs. So big casinos began to be developed, big entertainment palaces. And somehow he was able to negotiate out, I'm sure with the city managers as well involved in this, an arrangement with Hoover that as long as members of the mob were in Hot Springs, inside the city limits, they could not be arrested. So it became an R&R place for gangland figures. And of course they wanted to be entertained too, as well as the local folk. So interesting things began. We had an opera house, one of the first opera houses in the South. Big entertainment palaces where the top entertainers, first from Hollywood and other places, began to show up. So in the 30s, the top entertainers were all there. That's where I first saw it. It wasn't in the 30s, it was in the 40s. Guys like Frank Sinatra, Bing Crosby, and all those guys. Babe Ruth. The New York Yankees had a winter camp there so that baseball players could come down and practice. The Hot Springs Bathers baseball team got created.
The Hot Spring Bathers, that's the name of the team?
That was the name of the team. It was a St. Louis club. So Dizzy Dean and Lon Warnke and all those guys lived there. And Lon Warnke lived right across the road from us, so I got to meet him, Dizzy Dean and all those guys. So that was, now going along with the gambling, that was a big industry. Lots of money was coming in, and with that comes all the stuff that goes with the entertainment industry. So drug traffic was heavy, prostitution was all over the place, booze flowed all the time.
Maybe even during Prohibition.
Oh yes.
Yeah.
Dad was heavily involved in this. So was General Motors. I'll have to play the tape. Dad re-recorded some of Dad's stories on tape. Anyway, he was selling Pontiacs at the time.
No, so it really had moved up with the car trade.
Yeah, yeah. And the way he told the story was that an individual would drive into the shop and he would give Dad a $100 bill, and a half of a $100 bill. And Dad's job was to go to the phone and call General Motors and headquarters in Detroit and say, Mr. So-and-so has just shown up and he's given me a half of a $1 bill, whose serial number is. And Detroit would confirm, yeah, that was Mr. So-and-so. And that was the sign that Dad could turn over a car to this guy. The car, in those days, they had these big balloon fenders on cars. And the fenders were already equipped with shelving of some sort inside the balloon fenders. And leather belts containing different sizes of booze bottles would be rolled up and stuffed in these shelves in the car balloon fenders. And then the guy would drive off and go to Chicago or wherever he was supposed to deliver the booze. So during Prohibition, Dad was very much against Prohibition, but he was for the money that it was producing for him. So he was making money, not just selling cars, but Dad's...
Helping to transport.
Yes. Dad's opinion of Al Capone was that he was the greatest human being that ever lived.
There's a lot of people in Chicago, that, poor people,
Yes.
working class people who felt that
Right.
way about Capone.
And the reason he felt that way was because if there would have been none of this industry, this gambling industry in town, if it had not been for Capone. Apparently during the Depression, all of the soup kitchens that were set up and run by the churches, or overseen by the churches, were paid for by Capone. So people were able to eat and survive. They could get clothing, they could get rent money, whatever, from the Capone machine. Ernie Madden.
People had an attitude, kind of like a Robin Hood attitude toward him.
Yeah, oh yeah. Ernie Madden was one of Capone's hitmen, and he was placed in charge of running Hot Springs. He was a member in good standing in the community. He was a member of the church that I eventually joined up with. He was, you'd go downtown, and if Ernie came walking down the street, why, everybody was going to bow and say hello and seek Ernie's favor one way or the other. Certainly to stay in Ernie's favor. Because if you fell out of Ernie's favor, you were in deep trouble. But Dad saw all this good stuff that was going on for the people who lived there, who otherwise would have been maybe miserable.
What was your mom's attitude toward it?
She thought it was great too. Yeah, no problem. Mom and Dad were together. This was all very progressive stuff. This is what progressivism was all about.
So how about education, Jim? So your grade school and
My grade school? Well, it was a
I assume it's different than when your parents were going to school at this point.
It was called the Lakeside Consolidated School, and it was both grade school and high school. High school involving what we would call middle school as well as high school. So it was a school that ran from first grade all through the 12th. It was made up of families, or kids from families from farming communities and mining communities. We were not a town school. Hot Springs had lots of secondary schools and elementary schools. And everybody who lived in town was of a higher status, had a higher status than everybody who lived outside of town. Dad and Mom had helped form the Lakeside Consolidated School, which made them big wheels in the rural population.
How big was the school then? Would you say?
The whole school, maybe 2,000 at most.
And this was private then?
No,
No, it was public.
It was a public school. I got started in 1933, so during the New Deal, I guess. teachers were not the best teachers, I guess, in the world, but they were certainly better than the ones we would have gotten if we hadn't come to school. School was a fun place during the elementary days. The very first day in school, by this I mean something like this. Very first day in school, we had this gigantic paperweight fight in the first grade. And that sold me on school. This is what it was going to be. Great. So you made sure that you had some kind of fight every day.
So is it mostly women teachers?
There were a few men in the elementary school. Men began to show up in the 5th and 6th grade, but then once you got into the high school, it was about 50-50.
The administrators were probably men.
Yeah.
And now was the school all white?
Yeah, definitely.
How far away were you from the school? Were you trudging through 12 feet of snow?
No,
get to school?
by this time we had buses. But some of these kids had to get on the bus like at 6 or 7 o'clock because we were scattered out all over, especially if they were from the mining community. I would catch the bus at the top of Holiman Hill, and it was about a 15-20-minute ride.
What about the curriculum? How, was it just kind of like a standardized kind of thing? Okay.
Reading, writing, mathematics was the basic stuff. You got to the 4th grade, and then you began to pick up some history, some civic stuff. Then once you got into junior high, then stuff like physics, chemistry began to come in.
So what grade were you when World War II began happening? What grade
I
there?
started in the fall of 41, so the war had been on for 6 months. And the school was a very patriotic place. Part of the challenge of the school was how do students support the war effort. So the school had come up, by that time, it was clear that tinfoil was an important ingredient for ammunition. And all cigarette packages came wrapped in tinfoil. So the challenge was to collect as much tinfoil as you could collect. So I would, a lot of times, not take the bus to school. I would walk, and because people were always throwing their cigarette packages out of their car and collecting the packages and then stripping the tinfoil off the package. When you collected 10 pounds of this stuff, you got a $10 war bond. So by the time the war was over, I had $900 worth of war bonds.
Wow.
that was a
So
lot
your
of
older brother,
tinfoil.
was he draft age?
No, well, yes, but he was working in the bauxite mine, and bauxite was what aluminum is produced from.
So he was in a strategic industry then.
So he was in a strategic industry, so he got a deferment on the strategic industry.
And your dad would have been too old at this point.
Right. Well, he wouldn't have been too old.
No,
'cause
not
they began to
necessarily.
draft people.
Because they were drafting people in their 40s.
40s, yeah,
Mm.
he could have, but his shortness.
He was still short.
He was still short.
He hadn't grown any.
He might have wanted to go, I don't know. I don't know when this occurred. My guess is it was in '39 when Germany attacked Poland. Because there was one of the things that Dad was into was the radio, and we always listened to the radio after dinner to catch the news. I remember we all gathered around the radio to catch the news, and I don't remember what the news was, but I remember Mom looking at Dad after the broadcast and saying, "What does it mean?" And he said, "I think it means war." And that was before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Because I know that because since I was born in January, I was not eligible to start school in the fall of 1940. And somebody showed up, Mrs. Terry was her name, to talk to my parents about that. And that conversation took place before the attack on Pearl Harbor. It was in November, as I remember.
The conversation,
Yeah, with Mrs. Terry about
Yeah.
when I could start school.
because Pearl Harbor was in 41, December of 41.
Yeah.
So here's my first request, Jim, for a story that I know Joe and I have heard, but just for us to get it. So the story about when the bomb was dropped.
Oh.
Well, maybe,
That
just
pushed
just
it.
one thing beforehand,
Sure. Okay.
just one before. You described, what the kids were doing around the school and stuff like that. So, I mean, was that pretty much what filled the time? That was the kids were conscious of what was going on in the world and things. And did teachers talk about the war? Was there much discussion in school about that? And I know it's early years, but
Yeah, no, there's a lot of talk about it. And part of their job was to get kids ready for that. So patriotism was a big deal, and it showed up pretty early. I forget what grade. I think the second grade was when they started. We had to wear these uniforms. There were kids, and there were three kinds of uniforms. There were people who wore red uniforms, blue uniforms, and white uniforms. And the uniform you wore was depending on your grade level you were in. And
But you
then
mean
we
how
had-
old you were or how good you were in school?
How good you were in school.
Ah.
Of course, the white people were the ones who were making good grades. And
What color did you wear, Jim?
I wore red.
I'm guessing that probably wasn't that great.
That was not the good grade. So anyway, they would have these marches out in recess. We had this one period which was 30 minutes long, recess, and that recess was for marching on the playground, and they had these maneuvers figured out so that the red, white, and blue could mesh together, and these very patriotic kinds of things. So, and these were military uniforms. They were not something
Not
that
just
you could
school
just
uniforms.
throw together. We had the little, what they call furlough hats,
Oh, really?
that you had to wear, and the shirts were military-style shirts.
So before that, there had been no uniforms, but then they
When the war
instituted-
started, it caught on real fast.
Hmm.
And we had these drills, and they were of various varieties. They had these black silhouettes of ships, that is, Navy ships, and black silhouettes of airplanes. These were German airplanes, Japanese airplanes, and ships of the various nations, and you were supposed to be able to identify them. The teachers would flash these.
The ships, in case these ships would show up on the river?
Yeah, and airplanes.
Airplanes like a figure, but
So,
ships.
right, so it would, it would be your row, your turn, that row's turn to identify, and the teacher would flip these silhouette cards and go down the row, and each person had to
Interesting.
say, well, yeah, that's Petro Smith, all right, whatever.
So I'm guessing a fair number of these kids had relatives in the service.
Oh, yeah.
Probably,
Yeah. Yeah, nearly everybody had somebody in their extended family who was involved. Lois's, for example, for us, Lois's husband was in the Air Force. which was bad news for me because I got kicked out of my bedroom and the boys took it over because she stayed with us while he was going through basic. Marieta's boyfriend, who she later married, joined the Navy. That was his choice. He had killed a guy, and the judge, he was found guilty, and the judge said, well, okay, you can go to prison or you can join the military, so he chose the Navy.
That's still happening today.
Aunt Ura's son joined the National Guard. Excuse me, not National Guard, Coast Guard. Cousin got involved in the airborne, participated in Normandy, and the D-Day invasion, was killed there.
What happened at the school? I'm just focusing on the school now.
Mm-hmm.
What happened at the school when, kids, dads or uncles or whatever, they'd get the message that they got killed, and did that happen often? Was
Yes,
something?
it did.
Yeah.
In the school, once a week there were these assemblies where everybody from the 1st to 6th grade would gather, and if there had been a number of deaths in a given time span, I don't remember what the time span was, but then some clergy person from some church somewhere would lead a service in which those names were named off. The families of those men were invited to be present. Flags were given to the families.
So people really were, we hear this now about, the whole society being drawn into this, war kind of
Right.
situation. So it really was a day-to-day occurrence
Oh,
for
yeah.
everybody.
Yes.
Nobody was really cut off from it, or,
Mm-mm.
you really had to deal with it on a daily basis, so.
No, kids were making weapons. That is, there were a number of kids who were really good at carving. They learned this from their dad or whoever, and they carved out of big blocks of wood these machine guns, and Tommy guns, and rifles. And, everybody had a toy gun of some sort, and we would have these make-believe war games out on the school ground during recess, those kinds of things. Then there were two other things that were going on there too. There was the Army-Navy Hospital. It had been created up on the hill shortly after the Civil War, and it at that time was a place that cared for the most seriously wounded of the Civil War, that is amputees. Same with the First World War, and then it was a place where the most serious wounded from World War II was sent. Bethesda was the other place, I think. But this hospital was a gigantic structure, still is a gigantic structure.
And where was it at?
It's in Hot Springs.
Oh, in Hot Springs, right.
And the military took over all of the basic hotel facilities in Hot Springs. So we had, and these guys who took over the hotels, these were people who were there for security purposes. They were not wounded people, they were there for security purposes. They guarded not only the hospital, but by that time there were 2 local dams that had been built during the early part of the New Deal. And part of the fear was that submarines would somehow be able to get into the river and torpedo the dams. So these guys were there to guard the dams. They were also to guard the bauxite aluminum plant. So they were military all around. So and
Yeah.
that had its impact too.
Right.
Then another reason why these security people were there was that the POW camp was set up on the south side of the Lake Hamilton. And it was for German prisoner of war. And so
Wait, so they were shipped to Arkansas?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there were a lot of
There were prisoner of
POW
war
camps in
all
the
over
States.
country.
I didn't realize that.
So,
Mainly Germans and Italians.
yeah, right. And one of the ways that affected us, our family, plus the school, was that this one guy who was, had somehow gotten his family over to the U.S. before the war started, but was not able to get out of Germany himself, was drafted, sent to Africa, was captured, and was sent to the U.S., and ended up in this POW camp. His wife found out where he was and moved the family to Hot Springs. Well, not Hot Springs, down the road from us, about a mile. So that they could be closer to him. And of course, the law is that every kid gets to go to school. So this family had several children, and they got to go. They were assigned to our school. The oldest son, John, he was in the same grade as I was. So, and he caught the bus at the same place that I caught the bus. So we got acquainted with one another.
He spoke English, I assume, then.
Well, if he didn't beforehand, he did very soon. Somehow Mom got acquainted with his mother, probably through the selling of milk and eggs and et cetera. So we had met outside of school, and we're kind of buddies. Anyway, by the time we got to the 4th grade, people had figured out that John's father was a Nazi.
Took him a while.
Took him a while. Well, John wasn't going to talk about it.
Right.
So the kids started beating up on John. And this was every day, you know. And I was feeling pretty bad about this. John would go home pretty miserable. And he was a friend, and I should be sticking up for him. So one day I finally said, okay, this is enough. So we both got beaten up. Well, John's mom wasn't going to make a big to-do about this because she was afraid of what might happen to the family if she complained. But Mom, on the other hand, got really ticked off about that. So we ended up in the superintendent's office, and Mom raking the superintendent over the coals about this, and that was the last time we had any more beatings of John and me, I guess. Of course, the war was over in another year or so, all that faded, I guess. Although it would show up from time to time for John.
Now, after the war was over, was his father released? And
Yes.
allowed to stay?
They had their choice. Everybody in the camp had their choice. And I guess some of them decided to return to Germany. But many, I think probably most, decided to stay. And they turned that camp into a little German village. It's called Diamond Head now. And and gradually it became a place where tourists could go to rent a cabin and go fishing or whatever they wanted to do on the lake. So it's become a real money-making deal now. And the folk who started that were all the German prisoners who decided to stay.
Okay, well now, so your family, you know, your dad's basically involved in important stuff, or doesn't get drafted. Your mom is obviously, you know, thinking through all this stuff with the war and everything. And now that we're coming to the end of the war. First of all, war ends in Europe, and then we're getting to this point that Jeff had raised earlier about your story about the bomb. How does the situation in your family and how you talked about the war over the dinner table, which I assume happened, lead you into that, you know, that year, the end of the war?
Well, both sisters were, and Mom to some degree, were involved in the USO stuff. This was an organization created to cater to the needs of servicemen. And we had a bunch of them, especially the people in the hospitals. This would involve putting on entertainment, mostly drama kinds of things to entertain wounded soldiers, putting on dances for those who weren't wounded, parties for both. So these things were going on all the time, all over the place. We lived on this hill, which was a great place. It was a big house. The living room was probably as big as this room, if you moved out all the furniture. Had a great wooden floor. And so the two sisters would have these dances there in the living room. And just unbelievable number of service people of all branches would show up for these dances.
Dances in your living room.
Dances in the living room. There would be a band, and if not a band, then Philco Victrola would be pulled out. And
One of these
right.
kind.
And Mom would make these really great desserts and drinks, and it was a grand time. Down in the basement, Dad had somehow secured a big pool table, and so guys who wanted to play pool could go down in the basement and play pool. It was also a necking place.
Sounds like a major USO center right there.
Yeah, it was. So this gave me opportunities as a kid to find out what the stories were that these guys had to tell. And some of them, of course, weren't interested in telling not no kid what their story was. Others would tell their stories. Some of the stories were, most of the stories were not memorable.
At least what they were willing to tell you.
Right.
As a 9 or 10-year-old kid.
Yeah, right. Some of the stories were very heroic and very memorable, largely because of the horror that they generated. An example would be this one. This was a story by a guy who had served in North Africa. I forget what branch of the service. He was some kind of early airborne type person. They parachuted in anyway. And they had succeeded in taking some hill, I would guess a sand dune of some sort. At least that's my vision of a desert. And they came under attack, or feeling that they were coming under attack. Anyway, the order came to pull out. This guy had gone to sleep in his foxhole and didn't hear the order, and so his unit pulled out. He woke up by the noise of troops moving around in the area, and they were all speaking German or some language he did not understand. And so he understood what had happened. And sooner or later he was going to be discovered by these foreign troops. And he did not want to be discovered, and the only way he could figure out was to attack them. So he did, and he retook the hill. But in the process, he lost an arm and a leg. So this was a very heroic story, which was impressive, but it also was a very horrible story because you could see what the results were. And there were lots of those kinds of stories. Another one I remember was, this was told by a guy in the Navy who served on, I guess, a battleship or a cruiser. Those are, we don't have battleships anymore, but anyway, they were assigned a lead duty, and they were looking for the Japanese fleet. And this lone cruiser or battleship found them. And so a running battle between this lone ship and the Japanese fleet started. This guy was a gunner on the rear, in a rear turret on his ship, and they were fleeing the Japanese ship, and they were shooting at them, and they were getting shelled at the same time. Anyway, one of the other members of his gun crew, apparently this was just too much, and the guy went berserk, and somehow had a knife, and so he started whacking away at the other people in the gun crew, and this guy somehow subdued him, and got cut up pretty good himself, I guess, but was telling that kind of story about this while this running gun battle was going on. So I began to get the feeling, this war is not all it's cracked up to be. From these guys.
Not the great heroic struggle necessarily.
There were heroic battle stories, all right,
Right.
but there were other kinds of stories too.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Then in the spring of '45, we began to, well, actually earlier than that, Eleanor Roosevelt gave a radio broadcast sometime in probably 42 or 43 at some university back east, and the White Rose movement had occurred. And I don't remember what year that was, but it was in Munich. It was a bunch of college students and a professor who started a protest against the Nazis and the war. And they were all arrested and tried and murdered as for treason. And somehow that news reached the U.S. and Eleanor gave a speech at a memorial service for the White Rose participants, and that was broadcast. And we listened to that, and so I knew that there was a resistance movement in Germany, which changed my thought somewhat about what Germans were like.
Plus you also had your friend John.
Which I had John.
Yeah.
And I'd heard the story by this time about his father and getting the family out and all that. So there was something happening to my thought process, that's all I can say. Then in early '45, we began to learn about the death camps as photographs became available. Look magazine and Life magazine carried a whole series of photographs of the death camps. And other stories began to come out about atrocities that U.S. troops had carried out, and also about the bombing of civilians by Allied Air Force. Of course, we knew about the bombing of civilians in England by the Germans, but that was all right at the time that was happening. But then to find out later that we were guilty of that too.
It was all right in the sense that you expected it of the enemy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was
And
expected.
it was
They
the
were
good people who
they
was-
were evil. Yeah.
Yeah, it was the good people who were dying, but then it got
Yeah.
switched,
Right.
So war began to have a double meaning, I guess, for me. So then everything, after German surrender occurred, everything switched to the Pacific. Voice's husband got shifted to the Pacific. Moretta's future husband he was already in the Pacific. And in fact, he was they were getting ready to invade Japan proper. And we were getting some letters from him that were hinting that something big was about to happen. And then the news broke about the dropping of the atomic bomb. And Truman thought that was a wonderful thing, I guess, and so he ordered all the national broadcasting companies to broadcast the tape recording of that event. So we got in on we all gathered around. It was on a Sunday. I don't remember what Sunday. It had to be certainly after August the 6th, 45. And so we gathered around. It had to be after church service, so it had to be in the afternoon. And that broadcast was made. So we listened to that broadcast. You could hear the pilot talking to the members of the crew. You could hear the pilot tell the bombardier that he was in control of the plane. You could hear the bombardier say the bomb had been dropped. Somebody said, "Let's get out of here." The plane engines revved up. You could hear that. And then it was kind of a silent moment. And then somebody in the crew, later I found out it was the co-pilot, Robert Lewis, said, "My God, what have we done?" So I don't know if it was his words or the way he said it, but something really horrible had happened. And of course we already knew what that was, because we were getting stories from the newspapers about what had happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So that's what, looking back on it, that's when I pinpoint, for me, the death of Christendom. By that I mean Western civilization. On one side, the European side of it had collapsed, and now this was the New World side of it collapsed. I had been running away from home for many years, according to Mom. So it was a moment when I decided to run away. So I got Mike, my dog, and my backpack and put some stuff in it, and off we went into the woods. And Uncle George got the task of finding us. Other people were out searching too, I guess. I don't know how long I was gone, but it was several days. Uncle George found us and brought us back. So first reaction was real anger. I was just really angry.
How did
Talk to your
school
folks about
change?
it?
No, because they were happy the war was over.
It was over, so they didn't react to it.
Well, the reaction was, if we hadn't done this, a lot of Americans would be killed.
Yeah.
That was the story.
Mm-hmm.
So how did school change after that?
Everybody thought it was a wonderful thing. And that life was going to get back to normal, whatever that meant. But somehow I did not get into that. It was not a moment of celebration for me.
Why do you feel that you had that reaction? Do you know of anybody else in your, among your friends that may have had this reaction, or maybe you thought might have had? I mean, how do you feel? It's difficult when you feel like you're the only one that thinks that way.
Well, I did feel that way.
Yeah.
That I felt very lonely.
Yeah.
It was a lonesome moment. Everybody seemed to be very happy, just very happy. And that did not happen for me. I found out later that, much later, that there were others who were not celebrating either. One group that was identifiable were people who had been in the war, that is, who had been soldiers, and who were, yes, glad that the war was over, but are not able to forget what they had been a part of. There was a family, the family of our cousin who was killed in D-Day, who was not able to go beyond that. They got stuck on D-Day. They were never able to find the body of their son. So they weren't able to move on. So that darkness stayed in that part of the family, and some of that drifted over our way. So those, a part of the Christendom angle was that also the churches had been very much involved in supporting the war effort, and they were also very heavily involved in the celebration of things, and supportive of the bombing, using of the A-bomb. And that this was somehow a proof that goodness is rewarded by divine sanction.
God was on our side.
Yeah, God was on our side, but we already knew that God was also on the side of the Germans and their propaganda. So, you know, it was, all of that was just a farce.
But you're a 10-year-old kid.
Yeah.
And you're trying to
piece
make
this
sense
together.
of this.
Dad wasn't of any use because the only stuff he knew was Ku Klux Klan stuff, and I'd already knew enough about the Klan that I was, you know, his ideas weren't carrying any weight. Mom wasn't either. She had a little different slant. She wasn't as pro-West as she could have been, but she was still pro-West. So you were just kind of out there on your own. And we're moving into that time of life when some decisions had to be made about the local gambling scene. So, and the anger bit was, well, there's a way, what I make of it now, looking back on it, is that, okay, here's a way I can begin to make some sense out of my life by choosing what's available. And the choice was coming up, and the guy that Marietta ended up marrying was heavy into, that was the interesting thing about veterans. They came back in two frames. One was, okay, we're going to clean up the mess, the corruption that has existed. Because the corruption that existed from their point of view was part of the reason why they got sent off to war. The other group that came back was, hey, this corruption is pretty good, and it's still here, so the route of least existence is the way to go.
Give my piece of the action.
Yeah, so NFL came back this way. So he got himself involved early. So he already had killed a guy and was going to go to prison, chose the Navy instead, so he was already in that camp. So he had some good advice, and he advised me that, you know, gambling is the way you want to go. Don't go towards drugs, don't go towards the
So
prostitution angle.
How old are you when you're hearing this?
It would have, 45, was it 47, so I would have been 12.
Okay, so it's, you know, the year's over the war's over a couple of years now, and you're further on in school, and now you're beginning to look at what direction you're going to take.
Yeah.
Which sounds like a good break point.
Break point.
Because the tape's about to run out, so we can change tapes and then take a bathroom break and then determine what we want to do. So I'm going to stop it.
Good.
Very good.
Cool.
Because it's almost done anyway.
Got a lot